Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Wednesday, 17 April 2024. It is the 144th anniversary of the birth of Sir Charles Leonard Woolley, better known to posterity as C. Leonard Woolley, who was born on the outskirts of London on this date in 1880. Last year, I traveled to Philadelphia for a conference, but I had an ulterior motive for going to Philadelphia, which was to visit the Penn Museum. The Penn Museum has an incredible collection covering early civilizations with exhibits from literally all over the world. And I especially enjoyed the Egyptian, Etruscan, and Mesoamerican collections. But I went there specifically to see the Sumerian collection, because I had learned that the University of Pennsylvania, along with the British Museum, had sponsored the excavation of Ur in what is now Iraq. 100 years ago, it was a really exciting time for archaeology because the Roaring Twenties saw Howard Carter opening the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1923. Arthur Evans was excavating Knossos from 1922 to 1930. The first excavations in the Indus Valley civilization sites of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro were going on. And Leonard Woolley started excavating Ur in 1922 with the royal tombs of Ur being excavated in 1926 and 1927. Woolley had experience at several digs prior to Ur, including working at Carchemish with T.E. Lawrence, better known later as Lawrence of Arabia, who was 8 years his junior. And though he was experienced in contemporary archaeological techniques, Woolley was frequently making it up, you could say, as he went along. There was a little established in the way of best practices for archaeology at the time, and the technology was rudimentary at best. But despite the limitations of the time, Woolley clearly saw the archaeological imperative, we could call it. Quote, "It is, in its essence, field archaeology is the application of scientific method to the excavation of ancient objects, and it is based on the theory that the historical value of an object depends not so much on the nature of the object itself as on its associations, which only scientific excavation can detect," unquote. I think that almost any archaeologist today would endorse this succinct formulation. Further, Woolley had excellent instincts for getting artifacts out of the ground in as intact a condition as was possible under the circumstances. With the famous, for example, bull-headed lyres that were discovered at Ur, the frames were made of wood, but there were a lot of metal parts. So all the wood had rotted away, but had left the metal parts of the lyres intact in the ground. So the diggers dug all around that, and then they poured in wax and plaster into where the wood was, and then they were able to just lift this out of the ground in an intact way, so all the parts were more or less in the right place. Obviously, when objects or skeletons are crushed under tons of earth for thousands of years, there's a lot of deterioration. But Woolley's innovative methods allowed him to recover a lot of artifacts that might otherwise have been lost, and they have since been reconstructed, and they are on exhibition in the Penn Museum and the British Museum. The recovery of the artifacts from the royal tombs of Ur was a sensation comparable to the Howard Carter's earlier opening of the tomb of Tutankhamun. And if you visit the Penn Museum or the British Museum, you can see why that is. All of this archaeological work in the 20s led to the earliest period of human history being necessarily rewritten. Because of archaeology, our knowledge of the past is increasing, and the historical knowledge derived from archaeology is the raw material for both historians and philosophers of history. And it wasn't only our conceptions of the material culture of the distant past that was changed. The finds at Ur put ancient religion and mythology in a new light as well. The apparent ritual burial at the royal tombs of Ur is the kind of thing that makes you stop and think. It is a rare glimpse of the pageantry of ancient life. The ritual in which the bodies were interred would have been spectacular or horrible, depending on how you want to look at it, not only for the treasure that was buried with the bodies, but also for the many sacrifices involved. We don't know if the many bodies found in what came to be called the death pit at Ur were killed away from the site and then brought there and arranged at the tomb, or if they were killed on the site where they lay. And we don't know exactly how those in the death pit were killed. The current view is that they were probably given some kind of a drug that more or less numbed them or narcoticized them, and then they were dispatched with a blow to the back of the head. There was an artifact that was discovered, I think it's in the Iraq Museum now, of that is been hypothesized as the thing that was used to kill all the presumptive servants who went to continue to serve their lords in the afterlife, which is how these burials are usually viewed. We can't know for sure because the skeletons were crushed under the weight of all that earth and they were deformed. There's been subsequent efforts with more recent technology to reconstruct 3D images of some of the smashed remain that were kept in their intact state as they were found, and probably more of that work will be done. But there's a limit to how much we can learn from these artifacts. For all we know, the interment ritual, might have been quiet and serene with everybody just taking a potion to put them to sleep, or it might have been a horrific scene of sacrifice and screaming. So we have to ask ourselves questions like, in what kind of society will almost 100 servants be put to death with their lord to join them in the afterlife? And did they join in the funerary ritual voluntarily, or were they coerced? And if they were coerced, were they physically forced into this, or were they persuaded by their higher ups to go along with the whole thing? And maybe that was the only thing they knew as the society that they were born into, and they'd never heard of anything else. So it may have seemed entirely normal to do this. So Woolley's excavations forced these questions on us, and in so doing changed our conception of prehistory in many ways. For example, mythology scholar Joseph Campbell often referred to the royal tombs of Ur in his lectures, almost quoting Woolley's reports verbatim. There's one particularly well-known example is one of the female attendants that was found had a silver artifact wrapped up in her hand that on the other female attendants had seemed to be some kind of a hair tie, but it was still in her hand. And Woolley hypothesized that she had been late to come to the ceremony, so she didn't finish fully dressing herself for the ritual. So it ended up in her hand instead of in her hair. And Joseph Campbell repeats that in one of his lectures. I can't remember which one it is, but I've listened to that several times. I would say that archaeology has probably done more to expand knowledge of the human past than any other discipline in the recent past, though archaeology has been called what are known as the auxiliary disciplines of history, or the auxiliary sciences of history, also called the ancillary sciences of history. There is a Wikipedia article on the auxiliary sciences of history that names 23 auxiliary sciences, including things like podicology, which is the study of books as physical objects, and epigraphy, the study of ancient inscriptions. It's not a complete list. It leaves off some really obscure things like campanology, which is the study of bells, and some more important thing like folkloristics, the study of folklore, and mythography, the study of myths, etc. It's difficult to make a complete list of the auxiliary sciences because the more archaeology develops and the more technologically sophisticated it gets, the more it draws into itself other sciences. And the more sciences we add to the list of the auxiliary sciences of history, the more we see that there is no clear line between history and the remainder of the sciences. Woolley himself wrote, quote, "Between archaeology and history, there is no fenced frontier, and the digger who will best observe and record his discoveries is precisely he who sees them as historical material and rightly appraises them. If he has not the power of synthesis and interpretation, he has mistaken his calling," unquote. The elaboration of the detailed technique of archaeology has itself created many auxiliary sciences. So specializations like palynology, the study of pollen and spores, paleobotany, the study of ancient plant remains, and radiometric dating are all intersections of the physical sciences and archaeology. Obviously, radiometric dating couldn't come into use until nuclear science developed, and nuclear science only started developing in the middle of the 20th century. But as we add more sophisticated techniques to archaeology, it develops and grows outward, but it also draws these other specializations inward into archaeology, and it becomes much more difficult to draw any line between archaeology and the physical sciences, and on the one hand, on the other hand, archaeology and history. Today, most theories of the origin of civilization are the work of archaeologists. Given that archaeologists are professionally dedicated to the excavation of the material culture of the past, it should be no surprise that many of them endorsed historical materialism in one form or another. V. Gordon Childe was a noted archaeologist. He's even mentioned in one of the Indiana Jones films, who was working from Marxist perspective, although he keeps it at a pretty subtle level in his books, which are excellent and good reads still, 100 years later. Woolley explicitly addressed the Marxism of many of his colleagues. At the end of chapter 3 in his book, The Beginnings of Civilization, Woolley appends a 3 or 4 page note to the end of the chapter, where he contrasts what he calls a kaleidoscopic view of change, in which human history is no more than a kaleidoscopic change of whimsical patterns with no inner consistency and no principle of their development. And he contrasts this to the Marxist view of history as an orderly succession of stages of development. Woolley wrote in that note, quote, "Since the whole purpose of this book is to trace man's progress, it obviously does not regard history as a kaleidoscopic change of whimsical pattern. But nonetheless, I do find it impossible to fit the stages of progress in general to the Procrustean bed of what my Marxist friends term the law of social development. In my view, the different local varieties following from the specific conditions of time and place rule out any such conformity. Were the historical facts grouped according to a theory of the successive development of primitive communal and slaveholding structures of society, those facts might be more easily grasped, but the history would be misrepresented." This was at a time when the British scientific Marxists were relatively prominent in British intellectual life, and many of them held influential positions. So when Woolley mentions his Marxist friends, we need to take him seriously. And I've discussed this and the British scientific Marxists in my episode on Christopher Hill. Woolley then was not interested in a doctrinaire Marxism, but he was willing to engage in dialogue with what he called his Marxist friends. I doubt he would have endorsed any doctrinaire or particular philosophy of history, although Woolley's active period of work coincided with the Collingwood's attempt to formulate what we might call the first indigenous English philosophy of history. Philosophy of history was not particularly well studied or popular in the Anglosphere, but with Collingwood's work, it became much more acclimated to the climate, you could say. In the book, Creating Prehistory, Druids, Lay Hunters, and Archaeologists in Pre-War Britain, Adam Stout writes of Collingwood's role in the development of archaeology, quote, awareness of the questioner's positionality put Collingwood decades ahead of his contemporaries and freed him up to ask some uncomfortable questions about the nature of the past itself. The first principle of the philosophy of history was the idea that the past which an historian studies is not a dead past, but a past which in some sense is still living in the present. It is called into being by disentangling it out of the present in which it actually exists. And elsewhere, the past simply as the past is wholly unknowable. It is the past as residually preserved in the present that is alone knowable, unquote. Collingwood himself was an archaeologist, a Romanist, as Stout puts it, while Woolley was unearthing a much deeper past, which arguably could be said to lead to equally uncomfortable questions about the relationship of the present to the past, as with the meaning of the death pits at Ur. Woolley, like Collingwood, was acutely aware of the role of the archaeologist in constructing and reconstructing history. We might even say that the positionality of the archaeologist and how this positionality contributes to a unique view of the reconstruction of history. In Digging Up the Past, Woolley wrote, quote, as his work in the field goes on, the excavator is constantly subject to impressions too subjective and too intangible to be communicated. And out of these, by no exact logical process, there arise theories which he can state, can perhaps support, but he cannot prove. Their truth will depend ultimately on his own caliber, but in any case, they have their value as summing up experiences which no student of his objects and his notes can ever share. Granted that the excavator is adequate to his task, the conclusion which he draws from his own work ought to carry weight, and he is bound to put them forward, unquote. Since Woolley's time, many archaeologists have put forward their conclusions, and these conclusions, like Woolley's, increasingly shape our knowledge and understanding of the past. And in this way, archaeology continues to be, and probably will be at a even more significant way, a major contributing force in our understanding of the past. So happy birthday, Leonard Woolley, and thanks for listening.